Last little bit, I guess since October, and I really wish Andy were in here to see me go over this, we have been making a commitment to 3 core principles that we feel God is calling us to focus on for the time being. And the first is building a strong biblical foundation, both personally in our own lives and as a class. And then the second one is growing a Christian community. I can speak much faster than I can write. Around and on top of our biblical foundation. And then finally, third is taking our Christian community and coming together to do missions and ministry. And Mike talked about some of the ministry opportunities we've got going. Jed, of course, we did one yesterday. We can call ourselves missionaries, I guess. And next Saturday, you can come out and help with that. It's been a lot of fun, everything we've done so far. Jed does a really good job of that. So we started off talking about biblical foundations. We went back to some pretty foundational concepts of Christianity. We talked about Christian identity. We ended on talking about how to study the Bible. And then Andy transitioned us over to growing Christian community. He spent 3 weeks talking about witnessing. And then Derek came along and also talked about it last week. And in fact, as Andy and I were planning out the next several months of teaching back in December, we kind of went back and forth over where to put Derek. And Andy ended up suggesting we put in between Andy and myself. At first I thought that's because he thought Derek would work well with him, but then I realized that Andy didn't want to follow that act, so he threw me under the bus. Just kidding. It really worked out well that they taught on the same things. And then we'll be transitioning into missions and ministry here probably sometime in May. But right now we're down here in growing Christian community. So for the next few weeks, the next 4 weeks, we're going to be in 2 Timothy. If everyone wouldn't mind turning there, we will be there for the rest of the day. So Timothy is a pretty cool book. It's written by, and you can figure this out looking in the first 2 verses, written by the Apostle Paul to Timothy, with whom he shares a very close relationship. And most people believe 2 Timothy was written towards the end of Paul's life and while he was in prison. And that's kind of important to know because Paul was really unburdening himself of some very important things. Not to be overdramatic, but this very well could have been the last thing he ever said to Timothy. And he knew that, and I think he was making a strong emphasis on making sure that he made this count. So when we talk next week, beginning next week in chapter 2, you see Paul talks about the conduct of the Christian body, and that is pursuing righteousness. The next one contrasts righteous conduct versus wicked conduct and how God views that. And finally, chapter 4 talks about standing firm, mostly going off Paul's example, but just being Christians is hard. Being a group of Christians is even harder, and we're going to have to stand strong, and he talks about that. But chapter 1, before it talks about all these things together, it takes the church, it takes Christianity down to its lowest common denominator, where the church becomes irreducibly complex. In this, the body, the church, is made up of individual Christians. You and me are part of the body of the church. Everyone else is in the body of the church. And when I first started to read this, I thought that the common denominator of the church, lowest common denominator of the church, is the individual Christians. But as I dove in to this book, this chapter, I realized that's not the case. What I mean? Well, let's look at this. So last week I asked everyone to go through and read this chapter in advance and mark several words that we were going to list out and talk about. I'm sure everyone who was here did it, but there are also a couple new faces here, so we'll walk through this together. So let's start with God. It's a very important place to start usually when you're talking about the Bible. He's kind of the whole point. So let's, going through verse by verse, where's the first time that we see God mentioned? I'm not talking Christ. He is God, but he's a different member of the Godhead. So where's the first time we see God, and what does it say about him in this verse? Verse 1. What does it say about him, Wayne?
It said that God's will was that he was an apostle of Jesus.
So Paul is a disciple by God's will. All right, where do we see him mentioned next? Verse 2. What does it say about God in verse 2?
Grace, mercy, and peace from God the Father. Paul is writing to.
All right, where's the next reference?
Verse 3.
What? Paul thanks God. Okay, where does it say? Next one.
Verse 6, the gift of God.
Verse 6. What does it say specifically about the gift of God? Who gets it? How is it given?
He treats it like a spark. That's not what the Bible says. It says to fan the flame of the gift of God. That's it.
Okay, it is I like that. Spark or an ember, something like that. Mine definitely says fan the flame. Okay, so that was verse 6. What else does it say about God?
Verse 7, he hasn't given us the spirit of fear.
Has not given us spirit of fear. What kind of spirit has he given us?
Spirit of power.
In love and self-control.
Can't spell, I'm sorry. Spirit of power, love, and self-control. Does anybody have something different other than their translation, something different than self-control? Sound judgment?
Self-discipline.
Self-discipline? Yeah, I've got discipline. So, I thought that was kind of cool. I remember hearing different versions of this verse growing up. Anything else? Okay. What else?
Verse 8 speaks about the power of God.
Okay. All right, and I've got one more reference to God in this.
Verse 9, God saved us.
All right, God saved us. Okay, so one thing I have noticed over the years when you look at one of Paul's letters specifically, he's usually writing to another church or to a friend who's a member of another church, fellow believer, and he starts talking about all the things that God has done for us, God's actions, and then he starts talking, well, what do we do with that? What are the implications of that? And if you've read this chapter through a couple times, you see that God acts, And the people who are reacting, who are acting upon God's actions, are the other two main characters in this chapter. And that is Paul, and it's also Timothy. So let's go through, and we'll start talking about the Apostle Paul. What are we seeing in this about Paul? Paul is an apostle. All right, what else?
Just in general, throughout the letter, he's being very open-hearted about his feelings, and how he's proud of Timothy, the faith that he's shown.
Mm-hmm.
So,
If you look in verse 2, he even calls Timothy his son. Now, is that literally the case? Is Timothy his biological son? No. It talks about that in the book of Acts, and even talks about how Timothy's faith came from his grandmother Lois and his mother Eunice. So this talks this is a very important point to the relationship of Paul and Timothy. So what else does it say about Paul?
It says in verse 3, he spends a good majority of his time praying without ceasing for Timothy. And it says, desiring to see you. I guess in general, just walk with the Lord, I guess.
Yeah. So again, Timothy, Paul kind of cold, lukewarm about Timothy. Timothy's very important to him. So what else do we see about Paul? He's a mentor, very much so. Very much so. And how do you think, from Paul's reaction, Timothy's handled that mentor relationship? Probably listened to him. So what else do we see about Paul? That was verse 3.
He
Longs to see Timothy. Guys, kind of seeing a pattern here in these verses? Yeah. All about that Timothy. All right, what else? Guys, see in verse 5?
believes his faith is real. Timothy's faith.
Yep. He is sure of Timothy's faith. So yeah, you guys noticed a little pattern going on there in these first 5 verses. It's talking about the relationship between Paul and Timothy. So what else does it say about Paul after verse 5?
In verse 6, he is reminding him to
Fan the flame. This sounds like a great fight song. It's put that in a fight song that's inspired. Just kidding, that was in my school's fight song. Okay, what else?
verse 8, he's asking him to join in with him in suffering for the gospel by the power of God.
Mm-hmm. And I would like to point out that's true, but in verse 7, God's not given us a spirit of fear. That us is Paul and Timothy. Paul speaking to Timothy. So verse 8, what'd you say, Connor?
He said to join in him with suffering for the power of the gospel by the power of God.
With suffering by God's power. Okay, what else?
Also in verse 8, he's a prisoner.
Why is he a prisoner, does it say?
Therefore, do not be ashamed of the testimony about our Lord, nor of me, his prisoner.
Prisoner for Christ. I apologize, this marker's wearing out. Okay, so join Paul with suffering, What kind of suffering is Paul going? Oh, there's one. Thank you. You know, if you'll notice, talk about a problem, an engineer steps up and solves it. Okay, so join Paul in suffering. What kind of suffering is Paul going through? He's a prisoner. All right, what else does it say about Paul?
Verse 9 is brother in Christ with Timothy.
Oh, much better. So they've got this mentor-mentee relationship. But what else? What other kind of relationship is it? It's like one between brothers. Okay, what else?
Called to a holy calling.
He's called to a holy calling. Is that verse 9?
He also mentions that this holy calling is not because we have done, but because of his own purpose and grace.
Not from us. Totally a God thing. All right. What else?
Verse 11, he was appointed a preacher and apostle and teacher.
Preacher, apostle, and a teacher.
I replace this preacher with herald,
Herald. Now that's cool. What's a herald?
messenger.
A messenger. What did a herald do back in the day? Going all the way back to, did you guys ever see the old cartoon Robin Hood? It had the animated animals in it. You know, they'd have those alligators come in, they'd blow trumpets, and they'd say, attention everyone, and they would announce things. So they were the person who'd come in, they'd make a really loud noise, and they'd tell you something important, or at least something that they thought was important. So that's cool. I did not have that. Did not have that in my translation. Does anybody have something different than apostle or teacher? Okay, cool. It must be really inspired then. All right, so that's verse 11. We see anything about Paul after verse 11?
12, he's not ashamed of his suffering.
Not ashamed of his suffering. Why is he suffering?
Because of who he is.
Well, it's saying for this reason in verse 12, which points back to verse 11. So it's because of this stuff, because if he's been appointed to this, he's suffering. And I'm sorry, Elizabeth, what did you point out? He's not ashamed of the suffering, is that what it says?
Yes.
He's not ashamed. Okay, what else? While I'm down here. Looking at the rest of verse 12, it jumps out at me that Paul is sure of his belief and that it's worth it. Okay, anything else noteworthy about Paul? I'll just quickly summarize in the interest of time. In verse 13, you'll notice that he gave Timothy a standard of sound words. And I'm curious, in verse 13, does anybody's Bible translate that differently?
Got a footnote that says healthy.
Healthy.
Mine is the word, it's teaching.
Sound teaching. wholesome teaching. Wholesome, healthy. In other words, like wholesome food is something that hasn't spoiled. It's healthy for you. Talk about something sound. You want to have a sound foundation. If you knock on a wall and it doesn't sound like a regular wall sounds when you knock on it, there's something different about that wall, probably something bad. So that's what's going on here. What he's been taught is healthy and it is safe to rely upon. Okay, so we're doing very well on time. So last thing we're going to list out, and that is Timothy. And I swear, I promise, I'm doing this for a reason, and you'll see in a minute. So let's go through. Where do we see Timothy talked about?
Verse 2, the letters addressed.
Letters addressed to him. Okay, what next?
He's willing to be subservient
Mm-hmm.
follower. Since, I mean, if he's like his son,
Mm-hmm.
you know, some people want to be on the same.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. Yeah, subservient's not a word that most of us would say is this great positive. You wouldn't walk up, you're so subservient, and expect that person to take it as a compliment. So that's an interesting point. Okay, what else are we? What else do we see about Timothy? What does the text say about him?
He suffers also.
Where do you see that?
Verse 4, being mindful of your tears.
Yeah. Okay, what else?
On the flip side, he brings Paul joy. And that's the end of verse 4.
Good point. Brings Paul joy. Okay, what else?
In verse 5, he has a sincere faith.
Sincere faith. All right, what next?
He says in verse 6, which it goes back to the gift of God, which he was a fan, but he also mentions that it's in him through the laying of Paul's hands on him.
Okay, what next?
He also has a spirit not of fear, but power, love, and self-control.
Mm-hmm. What verse is that? Okay, I'm just going to draw a line. Just that it's the same thing. All right, what else?
Saved and called to a holy life in verse 9.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to go ahead and make another shortcut. He's been called. That's the same calling that Paul got. All right, that was verse 9. See anything in verse 10?
His Savior is Christ Jesus.
Saved by Christ. Anything else in verse 10? This one's not as immediately obvious. It's talking about something that's been revealed by the appearing of our Savior. And if you look back at verse 9, it had talked about God had saving us according to his own purpose. So God's purpose for Timothy has been revealed. Is that rain? It's been rain. That's a lot of rain. It's good. My car needed to be washed. How has God's purpose been revealed?
Through the appearing of our Savior, Jesus Christ.
Through the appearance of Christ. All right, very good. All right, where do we see Timothy mentioned again? We're almost done.
Probably 13.
Mm-hmm.
You have heard from me.
This is the sound words. Or healthy words, or teachings, or wholesome. All those things. All right, that was verse 13. What else do we see?
14, it says about the Spirit dwelling in both man.
The Holy Spirit dwell in us. Us being Paul and Timothy.
Well, Paul also says the guard, my Bible says the good
Mhm.
deposit that was entrusted to you, 100% wasn't his. So I guess that was.
This was verse 14. Yeah, I said, and guard the treasure. Mine says treasure. You have deposit. I like treasure. Big fan of Treasure Island. Somebody got a different word there?
Precious truth.
Precious truth. Okay, so whatever that thing is the precious truth. Very good. I like that. I like that a lot.
Mine says the good deposit.
Mm-hmm. Good deposit, treasure, precious truth. Mark this. I typically don't write precious very often. Okay, so I've got one more instance in verse 15, and that he is aware people turned from Paul in Asia. Okay, so that's all we're going to list out for today. So let's take a moment. We've gone through this one chapter. We've listed out all the references to God in this book, all the ones to Paul, and all the ones to Timothy. And technically speaking, these are the three main drivers of the events that we're seeing talked about in verse 1. Chapter 1. So what do we have? What do you have going on with God? What do we see Him doing over the course of what we've listed out in this chapter? These verses are not particularly relevant to what we're talking about. It's part of the salutation. So in these four references, what do we see going on here?
Qualifications of being in ministry.
Qualification, yeah, that's true. We're talking about, if you go back to verse 6, that was something that I like this verse. It's talking about, Connie, you talked about a spark, fanning the flames. Have you guys ever been camping? Who else in here has been camping? Or been to a bonfire? If you'll notice, like a fire, you throw all the stuff on there and it just explodes into flames, and then things calm down and you've got those embers going. And you can leave those embers and they give off heat for a very long time. But when they're down to kind of, it's gone a lot colder, you can throw more stuff on there, you can blow on those embers, you can fan it, get some air going on it. What happens? The fire comes back to life. So that's what that's what we've got going on here. And God's gift is that spark. What is God's gift? In the context of this chapter. If you give me the Sunday school answer of Jesus, I might come after you. Talks about it in verse 7.
The Spirit.
What spirit?
It's self-discipline, love, everything he needs to be able to be a Christian. He needs to be for the ministry.
Yeah. So God has given us the spirit that is not one of fear, but it is one of power, love, self-control. And actually, now that I think about it, I think when I memorized this verse for Awana, it said a strong mind. It also talks about the power of God and God saving us. So this right here is kind of the crux of the entire the entire chapter. And what is in verse 6? What are the first three words in that? For this reason. So Paul has talked about all the things coming up and before this, and he's saying, for this reason, he has not given us the spirit of fear. So what do we? Okay, so this is what God has done for us, and then we've talked about Paul. What has Paul done with this? With this spirit of power, love, and self-control.
Helped to spread it to Timothy.
He is what?
He's helped to spread it to Timothy.
Yeah, and he's done it through this relationship. And so he's done with this Timothy. He's telling, and then the rest of this is him giving instruction to Timothy. And what is he saying to Timothy? Saying, I've put this spirit in you, and you're going to have to keep fanning it to keep those embers alive, to keep that fire going. How do you fan it? What is Paul telling Timothy to do here? What is Paul saying?
That Timothy's going to have to suffer for Christ.
Yeah, specifically to join Paul with that suffering. And what is Paul's suffering specifically? What form of suffering is Paul going through right now? Spiritual. He's a prisoner. And what else are we seeing in here? He's in brotherhood with Timothy. They've got a holy calling. That's not about this because of us. So with this spirit comes with a calling. Paul's what kind of calling does Paul have? Specifically in verse 11, it talks about this. Preacher and teacher to the Gentiles. Mine also includes apostles. And what is that? What has that resulted in verse 12? More suffering. Because of this, and how does Paul react? He's not ashamed. He's sure of his belief, and that the suffering is worth it. So again, to recap, we've got God giving us a spirit of not of fear, power, love, and self-control, and out of that, Paul has had this relationship with Timothy, and he's given Timothy this where he's got to fan the flame to keep it alive. And the way Paul himself has done it is through suffering. It is through being a prisoner for Christ. It is being committed to this holy calling of being a preacher, an apostle, and a teacher, and being steadfast and not ashamed through the suffering, because Paul knows that it's worth it. So over here, we've got Paul's reaction. What do we see about Timothy? In these opening several verses, what's kind of the theme of those in regards to Timothy?
Just what I'm seeing through all this patterns is that
We're looking for patterns.
so not only is his relationship with Timothy like that of father and son in a way, it's also very much with him talking about passing on this flame, this spark, this spirit that God gives him and Timothy. It's like an apprentice being addressed by a master and being told that you're getting to carry the torch now. It's your time.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Take the boy and train him to be a Jedi. I'm just kidding.
I'm inferring that Timothy is willing to take on the suffering, and
Nice.
he's grabbing the torch, excited
Nice.
about it.
Very good. That hadn't jumped out at me. What's giving you that inference?
I can't think of it right now, but the fact that Paul keeps referring to his sincerity, it's not like Paul's trying to talk him into it. It's just like, here it is.
Yeah,
I'm at
specifically.
the end of my life, and you need to jump up now.
Exactly. Right here, the first several verses are specifically from Paul's perspective. It's talking about his relationship with Timothy. Right here, we've got Timothy's spiritual history at play. And what's that history look like? According to this, he's got a godly grandmother, Lois, not Superman's girlfriend, but she's pretty super in her own way. Got his mother, Eunice. Apparently, Lois was not super at naming daughters. And out of this, he forms a relationship with Paul. It's like a son. As Mike said, this is one of subservience. Timothy didn't try to become the next Paul. He didn't try to become the Christian rock star of the Mediterranean.
Tried to do his best.
Yes. And what else has he gone through with Paul?
He also suffers like his master.
Yes.
And this brings Paul joy because it also further encourages his belief that his son's desire to be a minister is real.
Yes. And his desire is real. Specifically, what does Paul say all this is brought about? That's sincere faith. So when Paul is telling him, fan the flame, this gift of God, that you received through me, that's not Paul boasting, by the way, but just Paul saying, look, I was there when it happened. I saw that take place. So when he's saying fan the flames, he knows there's something there. Because those of you who have been camping, been to bonfires, if you went out to that fire pit 12 hours after that fire or after a really big rainstorm, you could go and you could put as much just pure oxygen on those ashes as you wanted. What's going to happen? Nothing whatsoever. So for the flame to be fanned, you've got to have something there. There's got to be a flame, an ember, a spark, what have you. So this is Timothy's spiritual history, and you've got Paul coming along saying, fan the flame, and what is the rest of this chapter talking about in terms of Timothy? What Paul has said, okay, this is where you've come from, this is what you need to do, what do you need to do going forward? What's going to be the result of fanning the flame for Timothy? More suffering.
But he won't be fulfilling what he is meant to do.
Yes.
The spreading of the gospel.
Spreading of the gospel. And what does he get out of this? What does Timothy receive?
Perhaps the precious truth is something that grants him peace.
Mm-hmm.
That grants him the strength to get through this suffering.
Well, it is. I think that's true, but specifically, he's been. Hang on, let me go back to that verse. I may not have. Probably didn't write it right. Mine says, "Guard through the Holy Spirit who dwells in us the treasure which has been entrusted to you." Some of you have said, instead of saying the treasure's been entrusted to you, you've gotten deposit. Some of you have gotten what was it? Precious truth. So using a word like treasure or precious doesn't mean sweet and cute and cuddly. Go back to Lord of the Rings. My precious, that's something he highly values, something that is valuable, even if it really wasn't valuable in the end, it was destructive. Here it's not. We're seeing that as a result of all this, Timothy's gotten something valuable out of it. And we'll talk about that a little bit further. But in conclusion, so I talked about what Timothy chapter 1 goes through is basically the lowest common denominator, the lowest you can go in the church. And originally I thought it was going to be about us and our original conduct, and there is some of that. But in reality, the lowest common denominator within Christianity, within the church, where the church becomes irreducibly complex, that is the relationship between Christians. We can be Christians without being around other Christians, and there are a lot of Christians around the world who are very much physically alone. But for there to be a church, there's got to be more than that. There's got to be that relationship. That's what this is. So just looking at this, what are some of the elements of a Christian relationship? Mike mentioned when we were talking about subservience, we've got a mentor-mentee relationship. Does that mean all of us friends of you mentees are just by nature mentors? Just kidding. So what are some of the together elements that we're seeing in here?
I say that Christ is the initiator.
Oh,
That talks about
very
he has
good.
the power, he's giving us the Spirit.
Very
He's the
good.
one who starts going.
So yeah, Christ is the initiator. Lots of mentoring going on.
I hate to break off on a tangent, but y'all are making me think of studying. So, as I've told some of y'all before, I work with polymers, okay? So,
Mhm.
I know I'm going off on a tangent, but I'll get to it. So, polymers are chains,
Mm-hmm.
okay? They're atoms lined up in a chain.
So relationships, go on.
Yeah, but what's funny is that some of the most important polymers that are ever made are called chain radical polymerization polymers. And what starts those chains and what throws them out to where there's tens of millions of atoms lined up together in this single chain is the initiator.
So that is the most important part of this. So
I
you're,
think that's what Paul's saying. He's not saying follow my example necessarily.
Mhm.
He's saying go back to the original source. Your relationship with Christ is the most important, and with that, you can succeed. That's what Paul's saying. That's how I have gotten where I am, even though in prison, you know. But I think that's the same thing you're saying there. Comes down to the
and where Paul has contributed value to this relationship has been to pass that along to Timothy. Because Timothy's done a lot of good for Paul, but Paul's also saying, just kind of reminding him of where Paul has been good to him. Very good point. So yeah, so in other words, these really important polymers are, the most important part of those is what brings them together. Likewise, the most important thing in these relationships is Christ, who's initiated them. Which, probably didn't expect to come into Sunday school and hear someone say Christ is the most important. Okay, so what does that relationship look like? It's been initiated by Christ. Paul, once Paul had gotten to a point where he was sufficiently mature in his Christian faith, starts mentoring. And Timothy, while he was young in his Christian faith, became a recipient of that mentoring, a mentee, if you will. We should all aspire to that level. And once in that relationship, what's occurred? What have they gone through together? Joint suffering in verse 8. And they've gotten through this together because they've also been jointly encouraging one another. And you can see that in verses 4 and in verse 8. So those, just again, to me, just jumping out from the reading, after having pulled this apart, examined it, this is the most important part of church. This is the most fundamental building block of the church. And that is relationships that Christ has started, and just basically what they look like. Again, you're leading others to more maturity in the faith, you're suffering together, and you're encouraging one another through that. Is that a good summation? Am I missing anything in this? Okay, so that is that's chapter 1. Again, next week we're going to be talking about conduct of the body. So we've got these initial relationships, and then we've got, going back to Connor's example, these long change of things, where we've got other relationships coming into play. What does that look like? What do we do with that? That's going to be talking about the body of Christ. And again, that'll be next week. So between now and then, if you guys will read through chapter 2 a few times, and again, I think we can do all this much quicker. If you guys will go ahead and before we meet back together, just mark the places where we see God and Paul and Timothy. We'll list things out. Hopefully we'll be able to do it a lot quicker and get quicker as we go along. But that's